Greetings and welcome to World of Lies Part 2, Chapter 1. In World of Lies Part 1, some of the things we looked at included the rise of what I call the Kings of Wall Street, and the Morgans, Rockefellers, and the DuPonts. And we also saw how their empires were being dismantled by the Sherman Act. And we also looked at how the Federal Reserve was created and who was behind it, as well as the lies of the Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram, lies that were told in an effort to bring the United States into World War I, which in turn led to the birth of the military-industrial complex during World War I, masterminded by Wall Street tycoon and good friend of the Wall Street Kings, Bernard Baruch. And overall, it was important to go through these events as it gives us a better understanding of the world of lies that Samuel P. Bush, who we saw in the last chapter, rose up and thrived in. And of course his rise into prominence would set the stage for his children, and one son in particular, Prescott Sheldon Bush, Samuel Bush's firstborn son. And he of course is the father of George H.W. Bush, and grandfather of George W. Bush and John Ellis Bush, and great-grandfather of George Prescott Bush, who as of this production has been the Texas Land Commissioner since 2015, and is currently running for Attorney General of Texas. So now let's have a look at Prescott Sheldon Bush, and we'll go back to 1908, when a young 13-year-old Prescott would be sent to St. George's School, a private school in Middletown, Rhode Island. And I wonder if this might be the cause of the dissent between Prescott Bush and his father, Samuel P. Bush. Remember in part 1 of this series, that in 1901 Samuel Bush moved the family to Columbus, Ohio to work for Buckeye Steel. Prescott Bush was 6 years old at this point, old enough to understand and see his father Samuel over the next 7 years going from being well-to-do to being a millionaire and buying the family mansion in 1908. Only Prescott wouldn't be living in that lap of luxury just yet, as 1908 would be the same year that Prescott would be sent to live at a private school, St. George's, in Rhode Island. Anyways, after 4 years in Rhode Island, in 1913, Prescott Bush would enter Yale University, where he'd become the captain of the Yale baseball team, as well as the leader of his singing group, the Whiffenpoofs. And remember in part 1 of this series, we saw that the United States, in 1916, sent troops into Mexico, and I said we'll see someone later on that was involved in this that may surprise you. Well, of course, that someone was Prescott Bush, who in the summer of 1916 joined the Yale Battalion for service in Mexico. And notice it says that Prescott Bush was recently tapped for Skull and Bones, which he would enter into in his final year at Yale in 1917. And you'll find multiple sources on the internet that tell us it was Percy Rockefeller and Averell Harriman who arranged for E. Roland Harriman and Prescott Bush to get into Skull and Bones, which makes sense seeing as Percy Rockefeller is Skull and Bones class of 1900, and Averell Harriman is Skull and Bones class of 1913. And now we can see the next generations carrying on the connections and relationships first established by their fathers. A couple of other graduates of Skull and Bones class of 1917 that would go on to play a big role with the Bush family in the decades to come were Henry Neil Mallon, longtime chairman of Dresser Industries, who Prescott's son and future United States President George H.W. Bush would name his third-born son after, Neil Mallon Bush. And Knight Woolley, who would go on to work with Prescott Bush, Percy Rockefeller, and E. Roland Harriman in the decades to come. In the summer of 1918, after graduating from Yale, Prescott Bush would join the army again, re-enlisting as a captain serving in an artillery division on the Western Front in France during World War I. And in August of 1918, we see something extraordinary in the newspapers. Triple honor to P.S. Bush, Yale, 17. Yale man in remarkable exploit averts danger to Fogg, Haig, and Pershing. International honors, perhaps unprecedented in the life of an American soldier, have been conferred upon Captain Prescott Sheldon Bush, Yale, 1917, son of Mr. and Mrs. S. P. Bush of Columbus, according to the Ohio State Journal of August 8th. Bush, while in college here, was well and favorably known, and had many local friends. The State Journal says, upon young Bush, who has been serving in France as a member of the staff of Brigadier General Fleming, recently were conferred the Cross of the Legion of Honor by the French government, the Victoria Cross by the English government, and the Distinguished Service Cross by the American government. Possession of any one of the three is in itself considered a notable distinction. Conferring of the three decorations upon one man at one time implies recognition of a deed of rare valor, and probably of great military importance as well. From word which has reached Columbus during the last few days, it appears as if the achievements of Captain Bush well measures up to both these requirements. The incident occurred on the Western Front, about the time the Germans were launching their great offensive of July 13th, which was promptly turned into a disaster for them. The history of the remarkable victory scored later by the Allies conceivably might have been written in another vein, but for the heroic and quick actions of Captain Bush. The lives of three Allied leaders, General Foch, Sir Douglas Haig, and General Pershing, were momentarily endangered by a German shell. They were making an inspection of American positions. General Pershing had sent for Captain Bush to guide them about one sector. As they approached a certain battery, it was evident that the place was being shelled by the German 77s, but the generals proceeded. It is possible a German field glass perceived their movements, for a shell hit 20 yards in front of them. None were injured, although a fragment tore the boot of Captain Bush. The party then moved along more rapidly. Suddenly, Captain Bush noticed a shell coming directly for them. He shouted a warning, suddenly drew his bolo knife, stuck it up as he would a baseball bat, and parried the blow, causing the shell to glance off to the right. And clearly, Babe Ruth ain't got nothing on Prescott Sheldon Bush in 1918. The three generals marveled at the exploit. Apparently, they couldn't believe their eyes. They immediately took shelter and waited for the shelling to stop. Within 24 hours, young Bush was notified of the signal recognition that was to be accorded him. The three Allied commanders had recommended him for practically the highest honors within their gift. On the following day, there was a parade in Paris of soldiers to be decorated. As he was the only one to receive three honors, Captain Bush was placed at the head of the procession. Captain Bush is 23 years old. He was one of Yale's athletes for 4 years, ranking high in scholarship, was leader of the Glee Club, and president of the Musical Club, and in his senior year was elected to the famous Skull and Bones Society. During the summer of 1916, he camped with the Yale Artillery Battalion at Tobyhanna, Pennsylvania. At the 1st Officers Training School at Fort Benjamin Harrison, he was made a captain of the artillery. During the second school there, he was an instructor. Subsequently, he was at Camp Sherman with the 322nd Field Artillery, and before going to Europe attended the School of Fire at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, commanded by Brigadier General Fleming, who later placed him upon his staff and assigned him to the 15th Brigade of the Field Artillery. Captain Bush is the grandson of the late Robert E. Sheldon. He is a nephew of Colonel Harold M. Bush, who was in France with the 37th Ohio Division, and of Thomas H. Sheldon, chairman of the Columbus Area Sales Committee for Liberty Loans. That's simply an incredible story, isn't it? But have you ever heard either of the President Bushes talk about the World War I heroics of their father/grandfather? And I'll tell you right now that you never have. And that's because these events, including the parade in Paris, never happened. And it's nothing nefarious and there was no ill intent involved, but what happened was Prescott Bush, while stationed over in France, wrote a letter describing the above events in a joke letter to his mom, Flora, only she didn't realize it was a joke, and told the Ohio State Journal, who printed the story, as did newspapers from Connecticut down to South Carolina. And notice that Prescott's mom, Flora, wrote a retraction letter, one I haven't been able to find, but I wonder how many newspapers printed the retraction. A scandal you might have heard about that Prescott Bush was allegedly involved with in 1918 was that he and some of his Yale troopmates from the Yale Battalion supposedly dug up the skull and bones of Geronimo and put them on a mantle at the Skull and Bones Society House, or tomb as it's called.
Now a story about one of America's most prestigious universities, a well-known family, and a legendary American Indian leader. It's a story about secrets and bones and maybe about grave robbery. It's an 85-year-old riddle, and the solution may be hidden in the windowless headquarters of a mysterious society. The secretive Skull and Bones Society was founded at Yale University in 1832, and its members have included the elite of the elite. President Bush is a third-generation bonesman. He follows his father, former President Bush, and his grandfather, former Senator Prescott Bush. That's where the story really gets interesting. Many years ago, it's said Prescott Bush and other bonesmen dug up the grave of the legendary Apache leader Geronimo in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Historian Mark Wortman is the author of a new book about Yale men who served in the Air Corps during World War I. While he was doing his research, he uncovered a 1918 letter from a bonesman that suggests the Geronimo story is more than just legend.
I found it and said, this is amazing. This is quite stunning to see this. It was laid out so clearly in straightforward language, saying we've got Geronimo's skull, femurs, and horse tack, and we've brought it back to the tomb, as they call it, in New Haven.
Located on the Yale campus, the tomb is the windowless sanctum of Skull and Bones. Although the rituals conducted inside are shrouded in secrecy, it's said that to this very day, new members must kiss a skull during initiation rites. Are they kissing the skull of Geronimo?
I think that at the time that they took it, they certainly believed that they had his skull, his femurs. Whether that's true or not, nobody at this point can know for sure until they bring it back out and let it be tested.
Geronimo's great-grandson, Harlan Geronimo, wants answers.
I'm willing to volunteer and have my DNA taken and the DNA from the skull and do a genetic makeup.
Geronimo says he's hurt by the possibility his famous ancestors' bones were stolen and could possibly be a part of student rituals. So now the great-grandson of Geronimo is asking for help from the grandson of Prescott Bush.
I like to see, President Bush get involved in this issue and help return, the remains that was taken and also the artifacts that was taken back to the family, and have a proper burial, and restore the dignity back to my great-grandfather.
For now, the mystery continues. Does the club Skull and Bones have the remains of Geronimo? And if so, will it return them?
If they do have his skull, if they are using it in these kinds of rituals, they need to stop. And they need to understand that they're harming the legacy of Skull and Bones.
Correct. According to Apache tradition, when you desecrated a grave of this nature, you upset the spirits. And sooner or later, the spirits will come after you. And ultimately, it's going to lead in death. That's what, I was told in our tradition.
Well, we were unable to get any comment on the story from the Skull and Bones Society, but we did get a comment from Yale. Here it is. Skull and Bones is an independent organization that is responsible for its own activities, finances, etc. Like a number of other organizations, Skull and Bones was founded by Yale students, but it's not a part of Yale. They have their own building and they have their own rules. The statement goes on to say, quote, if something illegal were going on, that would be the responsibility of the New Haven police, but we have no reason to think anything illegal is going on, unquote.
If you don't know, Geronimo was an Apache leader in the mid to late 1800s, who along with his followers waged war and raiding parties on both sides of the United States and Mexican border. And finally, for the third time in 1886, he was in custody again, only this time for good. And he would die in custody at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1909. Now, enter Prescott Bush and his Yale buddies in 1918, who were sent to Fort Sill before going to Europe. And this is when they allegedly dug up Geronimo's skull. Only I don't believe they actually dug up Geronimo's remains, and I say that for 3 reasons. First, Sergeant Morris Sweat, the outpost librarian in 1930, says that Geronimo's family removed the body after a ceremonial funeral. And this was done because they didn't want either the white man or disgruntled Apaches, of which there were many, who held Geronimo in murderous contempt, believing he had cost them everything, but they didn't want anybody to desecrate his remains. Second, from 1940, General Cubison recalled when he was there for the funeral that all the white men were stopped just outside the post, and only the Apaches knew where they had buried him, which he says they kept secret all these years, at 1940 by that point. And this kind of matches what Sergeant Morris Sweat says, in that people visiting the cemetery in the supposed gravesite were not really visiting his real gravesite at all, as apparently his people, or relatives, which are his people, removed his body immediately after the ceremonial funeral. And there's another more modern account that matches this, as apparently in 1989, an Apache tribal chairwoman said that Geronimo's body had been moved from Oklahoma, where Fort Sill was, to New Mexico. Now the third reason I say that I highly doubt Prescott Bush and his friends dug up Geronimo's remains is because there's never been any official or media accounts of Geronimo's grave ever being vandalized, robbed, dug up, disturbed, or whatever. Here's the letter from 1918 that talks about Geronimo's skull and femur, saying that it's now safe in the tomb, meaning Yale's Skull and Bones tomb. And here's the thing, although the evidence suggests that Geronimo's remains were removed and relocated immediately after the funeral in 1909 by his family, or his people, this letter suggests that in 1918, Skull and Bones members did indeed visit the Apache burial grounds northeast of Fort Sill, and did indeed dig up the skull and femur of someone. So if true, and there actually is someone's skull on display inside the Skull and Bones tomb, and this letter certainly suggests that it's true, then that would make Prescott Bush and his buddies literal grave robbers. And it doesn't matter if it's Geronimo or not, the disgusting act of digging up anyone's remains to put on display in a manner of pride is the work of sick and twisted individuals. And again, if it is true, think about the last 100 years of Skull and Bones members who have walked by it with the same gleam of pride in their eyes. Anyways, Prescott Bush was given an honorable discharge from the Army in April of 1919, and he would go back home and briefly work for his father, who he didn't get along with. And later in 1919, he would move to St. Louis and start working for one of his Yale friends selling hardware. He would also meet and start dating Dorothy Walker, who was the daughter of another of the Wall Street elites, George Herbert Walker. And that's where the two President Bushes get their names from. So, George Herbert Walker Bush, who went from CIA director to vice president shortly after, and then president, had Samuel P. Bush and George Herbert Walker for grandfathers. We looked at Samuel P. Bush in the last chapter of part 1 of this series. So now let's take a quick look at George Herbert Walker. In 1900, George Herbert Walker would open up G.H. Walker and Company, and by 1901, we can see that they were members of the New York Stock Exchange, the St. Louis Stock Exchange, and the Chicago Board of Trade. And of course it wouldn't be proper if we didn't find a scandal that he was allegedly involved in now, would it? So skip to November of 1913, and we see a scandal involving the sale of some railroad line that would end up in the control of the Frisco line. Now I haven't really looked too much into this, but apparently an investigation by the Interstate Commerce Commission named a syndicate that profited at least $3 million from an apparent scam. And they released the names of the financiers, and some of the bigger ones we see, G.H. Walker and Company, who put in $60,000. And of course, George Herbert Walker was president of G.H. Walker and Company at this time. But by 1920, now in New York, we see George Herbert Walker as a director in Morton and Company Incorporated. And here we see some familiar faces in Averell Harriman, Percy Rockefeller, and Samuel Pryor. And we see that George Herbert Walker is also the president as well. And also in 1920, we see George Herbert Walker would become president of the USGA, or the United States Golf Association. And this is where the Walker Cup gets its name from. And the trophy was originally donated by George Herbert Walker as well. And we see in 1921, Britain getting on board. So that's a quick look at George Herbert Walker. And remember in part 1 we saw that Samuel Bush's wife and Prescott's mother Flora Bush, was killed after being hit by a car in September of 1920. And about a week later, we see that the driver, Herbert Davis, was charged with manslaughter. And ultimately, I have no idea how this case ended up. A couple of months later, in November of 1920, we see Mr. and Mrs. George Herbert Walker of 453 Madison Avenue have announced the engagement of their daughter, Miss Dorothy Walker, to Prescott S. Bush of Columbus, Ohio. A year later, in August of 1921, Prescott Bush and Dorothy Walker would get married, making George Herbert Walker Prescott Bush's father-in-law, who we'll see he liked, worked with, and had more in common with than his own father, Samuel P. Bush. And one of the things that George Herbert Walker liked about Prescott Bush, no doubt, was that Prescott was an avid golfer. And here we can see that in September of 1921, a month after getting married, Prescott Bush would be competing in the National Amateur Championships. And looking at some of the social circles Dorothy Walker Bush ran with, we can see at a Rockefeller wedding in 1923, the bride's attendants were Rockefellers and Mrs. Prescott S. Bush of Columbus, Ohio, formerly Miss Dorothy Walker. And with Prescott not gaining much traction in the various jobs he was doing, in 1924 we see his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, is now both president and a director at W.O.L Harriman and Company, which was started up by Averell Harriman in November of 1919. And George Herbert Walker would bring Prescott Bush into the fold. And there, we again see a familiar cast of characters. And another of the junior members, along with Prescott Bush, was his and E. Roland Harriman's 1917 Skull and Bones classmate, Knight Woolley. And remember, Percy Rockefeller and Averell Harriman were also Skull and Bones alumni. And we'll come back to W.O.L Harriman and Company in a minute. But moving forward to November of 1927, we see that Prescott Bush has been nominated to be Secretary of the USGA, United States Golf Association, which he would then become. And then fast forward to January of 1935, and we see Prescott Bush becomes the President of the United States Golf Association, just like his father-in-law George Herbert Walker 15 years earlier. And would see pictures of Prescott Bush in the newspapers around the country, congratulating and awarding trophies to the winners of the golf tournaments. Now back to W.O.L Harriman and Company, and at various points around this time, there were a number of Harriman-related entities. And in December of 1930, W.O.L Harriman and Company and Brown Brothers and Company, who were another of these century-plus-long banking houses that began in 1818. And to note, in the early 1900s, Brown Brothers and Company were heavily involved in the affairs of countries in South and Central America, especially Nicaragua. And keep that in mind as we'll come back to that in a later chapter. But anyways, W.O.L Harriman and Company and Brown Brothers and Company would merge in December of 1930 and become Brown Brothers Harriman and Company. George Herbert Walker wouldn't be part of this new merger, and we'll see what happened with him in a moment, but Prescott Bush would stay on and be a founding partner of the new firm. On December 13th, 1930, we see one of the Harriman entities making a statement. Harriman and Company, the New York Stock Exchange firm which has maintained a Washington office for many years, has issued a statement saying they are in no way connected with the firms included in the consolidation of Brown Brothers and Company, W.O.L Harriman and Company, and Harriman Brothers and Company. And we can see what George Herbert Walker went on to do in this court case from 1946, which lets us know that G.H. Walker, George Herbert Walker, was the president of Harriman-15 from its organization to its dissolution. So though he left his position as president of W.A. Harriman and Company when it was merging with Brown Brothers and Company, as you can see, George Herbert Walker was still very much involved with the Harriman brand, and his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, as we'll see coming up. And we'll see what some of the entities controlled by some of the members of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company were doing in the 1930s. And on a side note, in the 1930s, Prescott Bush was also on the board of directors of a newly founded CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, thanks to a connection through Averell Harriman. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean in the 1930s, events were taking shape that would lead the world into another devastating global war that would include genocide, and only come to an end after the slaughter of over 75 million people. And here's a good question. Considering the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and there was a global depression going on through the 1930s, how is it that Nazi Germany was able to rise and build enough wealth and power to launch the world into war in 1939? You'll hear that they were a very industrious and proud people, and had plenty of natural resources and so on, and that's true enough. But Nazi Germany alone most certainly could not have grown to the power it was by the late 1930s on its own. And after World War I, do you think countries like Britain, Belgium, France, Russia, or Poland were going to help build up Nazi Germany? They all still owed billions to the United States from the First World War.
What about the rest of the world? Did it not know the intentions of the Third Reich? Did it not hear the words of Hitler's broadcast all over the world? Did it not read his intentions in Mein Kampf, published in every corner of the world? Where's the responsibility of those American industrialists who helped Hitler to rebuild his armaments and profited by that rebuilding? Are we now to find the American industrialists guilty? No, Your Honor, no!
Now those words were never spoken at the actual Nuremberg trials, but there's a ton of truth in them nonetheless. And we'll delve a lot deeper into that in another chapter to be sure, but for the purposes of this chapter, let's have a listen to this. BBC Radio originally broadcast this in 2007, and they're talking about another scandal in the 1930s, investigated by Congress in what's commonly known as the McCormick-Dickstein Committee. And it's yet another scandal that we'll look into in yet another chapter. But about the McCormick-Dickstein report, we hear.
Later in the McCormick-Dickstein report, a shipping company called Hamburg America Line was accused of providing free passage to Germany to American journalists willing to write favourable copy on Hitler's rise to power. The company is also alleged to have brought Nazi spies and pro-fascist sympathisers into America. John Buchanan has studied this later section of the report and has discovered that one of the company's managers came from a very famous family.
The thing that surprised me most was to discover in the documents that this company, Hamburg America Lines, had in fact been managed on the U.S. side at the executive level by Prescott Bush as part of a web of Nazi business interests that were all seized in late 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act by the U.S. Congress, and Prescott Bush is the grandfather of the sitting President of the United States.
And of course, Prescott Bush is also the father of another U.S. president. And not mentioned, but very much involved, and a little higher up in the food chain, is Prescott's father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, grandfather and great-grandfather of 2 U.S. presidents. So let's have a look at the Hamburg America line and see how this all played out. And here's the cover sheet of a letter sent May 29, 1945, from the Office of Alien Property Custodian in New York to Lloyd Shawless, who was the secretary of the Office of the Alien Property Custodian in Washington, D.C. And he writes, this document confirms the seizure under vesting order number 126 of the first Bush-Walker-Harriman managed U.S. business, Hamburg American Line. And notice he mentions it as the first of the Bush-Walker-Harriman managed businesses, in reference to the ones that were seized. And it's a convoluted history, but it would correctly be the first German interest that Alvar Harriman had ownership in. Then later, George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush would become involved. But by the time of the seizures of the Nazi businesses in the United States related to Harriman, Walker, and Bush, for the Hamburg American Lines, W.A. Harriman no longer had controlling ownership in the company, but did have major stock interests and were managing the U.S. side of things. From the Federal Register on September 5, 1942, we can see vesting order number 126, seizing the assets of the Hamburg American Line / North German Lloyd under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And note here they say, all property of any nature whatsoever owned or controlled by, and they name a couple of the German executives as by this point it's a German-owned company. But they also add, and or any and all others, and this is the category that Harriman, Walker, and Bush would fall under. And we see here it was first executed August 28, 1942, which matches the date on the letter sent between the Alien Property Custodian offices in 1945 that tell us that the Hamburg American Line was the first of the Bush-Walker-Harriman managed businesses. The next page talks about how the United American Line of Delaware is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hamburg American Line and its capital assets, therefore was one of the vested assets in this case. Now to better understand it all, we have to go back to the beginning, which is just after the First World War, in June of 1920, and we see U.S. ships to open Hamburg trade routes. Former trade routes of the Hamburg American Line, closed in 1914 when all German shipping was driven from the seas, are to be reopened with American tonnage supplied by the Harriman interests. It was announced yesterday by W.A. Harriman and Company Incorporated. In explaining this agreement, Mr. Monks, who was president of Harriman and Company, as opposed to W.A. Harriman and Company, said, "We've got the ships, we've got the capital, the Hamburg American Line has the know-how." And we can see the importance of this relationship where Mr. Monks says, "The Germans are in the position of a man who gives away a part of his patrimony to preserve his future. They cannot build ships today as the treaty stands. Germany must turn over a certain amount of tonnage each year to the Allies. If the Hamburg Americans should attempt to build ships, somebody might come along when they were finished and say, 'Those are mine.'" And something else Mr. Monks, president of Harriman and Company, says, I find to be rather interesting, and keep in mind it's only 1920, but it sort of shows the mindset of thinking going forward from that point. Anyways, Mr. Monks goes on to say, Every businessman who has been abroad within the last 6 months has come back and said that we must put Germany back on her feet. We fought to destroy her, now we've got to fight to put her on her feet, and this will be the hardest fight. It's an absurd situation, but I guess it's the truth." And while researching this, I came across a very interesting episode in the younger days of Lester Monks when he was a Harvard student. Found in an article in the Boston Globe when Monks died in September of 1927. They called this episode, which took place in 1896, one of the most celebrated criminal cases in the history of America, in which Mr. Monks, as a witness, was next in prominence to the defendants themselves. The case was that of the murders on the barkentine Herbert Fuller, which back in 1896 sent shivers up and down thousands of spines. Somewhere on the high seas between Boston and Halifax, on a starry night early in July of that year, the captain and second mate of the Herbert Fuller and the captain's wife were murdered in their bunks with an axe. When the ship reached Halifax, it was in the charge of Monks and a steward, while Thomas Bram, the first mate, and Charles Brown, a seaman, were in irons. The Halifax authorities locked up Monks and the entire crew. Monks, son of a family of ship owners and bankers, was soon paroled, of course, but the entire crew was virtually held prisoners until the final disposition of the case 25 months later. The story told the authorities was gruesome, and as they delved further and further into the facts, the mystery became deeper. It appeared that on the night of the murders, only 6 persons were aft, meaning the back of the ship. On deck were Bram, the first mate, and Brown, the helmsman, and below deck was Captain Charles I. Nash, who was asleep in the chart room, and his wife Mrs. Nash, who was asleep in her bed in the captain's cabin, and August Blandberg, who was the second mate, who was asleep in his bunk in a room adjacent to the captain's cabin, and Monks, whose stateroom was between the chart room and the captain's cabin. The story Monks gave was that he heard a woman scream, saw the captain's body on the chart room floor as he ran through it and up onto the deck, where he said Bram, the first mate, hit him with a piece of wood, which Bram admitted to because he saw a passenger running on the deck with a gun, which spooked him. The entire crew was alerted and the bodies were found. And here's what's really interesting. Monk's escape was regarded as miraculous. He was the only one below who escaped, and murders were committed in both rooms into which the doors of his stateroom opened. Ultimately, Brown and Bram were charged with the murders, though neither of them were likely the guilty party. And while Brown was cleared, Bram was convicted and sentenced to life in jail. And while maintaining his innocence the whole time, he was paroled for exemplary behavior in August of 1913. He then went to Atlanta and became a respected businessman with a small chain of restaurants, and by 1919 was pardoned of the murders by President Wilson, which is more than likely the right move. Meanwhile, as we saw, Monks would go on to become the president of Harriman & Company, advocating for the rebuilding of Germany, which in turn would be laying the groundwork and foundations that the Nazi Party would inherit once they came into power. Anyways, that's some background on Harriman & Company's president, Lester Monks. And though I'm not saying for sure that Monks committed the murders, but when looking at everything, including much more than we didn't look at here, if I had to choose between the three of Monks, Bram, or Brown, I would easily conclude that Monks was the guilty party. But it's his prominence of being the son of ship magnates and bankers that gets him off the hook. Now back to Averell Harriman's Hamburg American line, we see in September of 1920, Harriman in contempt and shipping deal. The Kerr Steamship Company filed a complaint that its ships were being illegally diverted to the Hamburg American line routes, and we see Averell Harriman and others being held in contempt of court, including the Kerr Navigation Corporation, owned by the Harriman interests. So that's kind of odd. The Kerr Steamship Company is facing off against Hamburg American Line under the control of Averell Harriman at this point, and who's also its president, and the Kerr Navigation Corporation, that also happens to be owned by Harriman interests. So is this like some sort of industrial Kramer versus Kramer or something? And what about the American Ship and Commerce Corporation? Who are they? Well, if we go back to just less than a month earlier, in August of 1920, we see that the American Ship and Commerce Corporation was already being controlled by Harriman, and was now merged into his Hamburg American line. And we also see that at this point in time, the Hamburg American deal makes W. Averell Harriman one of the most powerful figures in the industry, meaning the shipping industry. In fact, his activities in that line bid fair rival to those of his father, the late E.H. Harriman, in the railroad world. So Averell Harriman by 1920 is already positioned as an industrial giant on par with the status of his father, E.H. Harriman, who we briefly saw a couple of times in part 1 of this series. And it's into this world of the second generation of the elites of the Wall Street Kings that George Herbert Walker, who was already a Wall Street tycoon of his own by this point, and then Prescott Bush, would become aligned with. Anyhow, back to the court case of Kerr versus Kerr. I found the New York Supreme Court ruling on the case from September of 1920, and we'll come back to this page in a minute. But here we can see, prior to July 1919, the plaintiff corporation managed and operated for a corporation known as the Kerr Navigation Corporation, but not the defendant herein, 8 steamships owned by that corporation. So the plaintiff is the Kerr Steamship Company, and they used to operate 8 ships for the Kerr Navigation Corporation, who we saw our Harriman owned. And what happened was the American Ship and Commerce Navigation Corporation, another line now owned by Harriman, had bought out the Kerr Navigation Corporation. And, subsequently, the original Kerr Navigation Corporation was dissolved, and the American Ship and Commerce Navigation Corporation adopted its name and is the defendant herein. So really the case isn't so much as Kerr versus Kerr, but it's more like Kerr versus Harriman. Now going back to the first page, we can see from the terms of the agreement that the plaintiff, the Kerr Steamship Company, has the right of management and control of the defendant's steamships until October 22, 1920. The defendant, the Kerr Navigation Corporation, now under Harriman control, on September 4, 1920, notified plaintiff that it was at once assuming the control, operation and management of all ships owned by it and has taken possession of one of them, which is clearly a breach of the contract, which is what the courts decided as well, as they ruled. The motion is therefore granted. The defendant, its officers, directors, agents, attorneys, and employees are directed to cease from interfering or attempting to interfere with the possession, management, and control by the plaintiff of the ships. So the now Harriman-owned Kerr Navigation Corporation lost the case. And something I found a little interesting is in looking through the entire case, we don't see mention of the name Harriman anywhere. Now I'm not sure the reason for Averell Harriman to be held in contempt of court during this trial, but perhaps he was rather angry at losing the case? At any rate, it wouldn't affect his prospects going forward, as we see by September of 1923. U.S.-German ship combine prospers, Hamburg American and Harriman lines forging back to pre-war power. The Harriman Group, which is headed by the brilliant young son and heir of the late E.H. Harriman, W.O.L Harriman, is better known as the United American Lines of New York. It is with that corporation that the Hamburg American allied itself in June 1920, as we just saw. "18 ships altogether are employed in the Harriman-Hamburg services. The most prominent American vessels are the Resolute, the Reliance, the Mount Clay, and the Cleveland." Now here's something interesting, and it's right around this time that Averell Harriman is selling off most of his shipping interests to German ownership. And in this article from July 1926, they're talking about 3 of the ships being transferred over to the German side. And we see the 3 ships have been operated by the Harriman interests under the Panama flag to avoid United States liquor regulations. So how about that? And that's because they're right smack in the middle of Prohibition. And keep this little episode in mind as we'll be visiting this again in some upcoming chapters. But as I say, it's around this time that Averell Harriman is selling off his ownership interests in Hamburg American to the German side. But we can also see that United American is supposed to have acquired stock in the German concern to the extent of 10 million Reichmarks, par value, which will enable the Harriman firm to retain an important interest in the operating of the ships. Which is why and how we see that by 1942, the Hamburg American line is only being, quote, managed, end quote, by the Bush-Walker-Harriman combination, on the US side of course. And notice in the 1945 letter between Alien Property Custodian offices, they mention Bush first, not Harriman, who in the grand scheme of things would be his superior of course. But I suspect that's because Bush had more of a hands-on connection to things more so than Harriman or Walker. And of course I can't prove that, but you'll see why I say that in a minute, as we have a look into the McCormack-Dickstein report. And here Congressman Samuel Dickstein is interviewing Captain Dreschel of the Hamburg American Line / North German Lloyd, who are the German ownership of the combined shipping lines now. And we see him asking, "Let us develop that point a little further. Every boat has a Nazi leader?" And Captain Dreschel answers, "Yes, sir." And Congressman Dickstein asks, "You never had a Nazi leader before January of 1933? And Captain Dreschel answers no on the next page. And that's because Hitler had just come to power in 1933. So Captain Dreschel is testifying in 1934 that every boat of the Hamburg American Line, North German Lloyd, has a Nazi leader on board. And Congressman Dickstein continues on the subject. "Wait a minute, I will clear things up for you if you want to. The National Socialist Party has a program to carry out in Germany." And Captain Dreschel answers, "Yes, sir." And Dickstein asks, "And any members of your crew, whether it is 75% or 60% and so forth, who are members of the National Socialist Party, are sworn to observe and carry out the mandates of the National Socialist Party?" And Captain Dreschel answers, "That is right." And Dickstein continues, These men have a Nazi leader on that boat. And Dreschel answers, that is right. And Dickstein says, he is put there not as a figurehead, he is put there for a certain purpose. That is true, is it not? And Captain Dreschel answers, yes, sir. And Dickstein asks, that purpose is to carry out the dictates and the mandates and the orders of the party? And Captain Dreschel answers, yes, sir. So, by 1934, every boat in the Hamburg-American Line North German Lloyd combination was stocked with Nazis, and had a Nazi leader on every boat as well. Here we see Congressman Karl Wieben asking Major Benno von Stolpnagel about a Nazi captain, Mensing. And Stolpnagel says, I have seen him about twice. As far as I know, he is something in the shipping of the Hamburg-American Line. And Wiedemann asks, Captain Mensing was connected with the Hamburg-American Line? And Stolpnagel answers, yes. And to find out a little more about this Captain Mensing, I found this thesis published by the College of Arts and Sciences and the Department of History of the Miami University. And in it we see, as previously mentioned up to 1932, Nazi agents and pro-Nazi sympathizers in America secretly smuggled in pro-Nazi anti-Semitic literature to be disseminated throughout the United States through the North German Lloyd Hamburg American Steamship Company, headed by Captain Mensing. And remember how we saw through Congressman Dickstein that every boat on the Hamburg American Line North German Lloyd had a Nazi leader to ensure the Nazi crew members stick to the Nazi policies and orders, etc. But those Nazi leaders would report to Captain Mensing. And next we see something I find to be very revealing. Congressman Wiedemann is asking Stolpnagel about a Frank Machinsky, who was a German national but not part of the Nazi Party, though he was a member of the German Stahlhelm, or Steel Helmets, which was an organization kind of like a union made up of German World War I veterans, and it had branches all around the world, including the United States and Canada at the time. Anyways, Wiedemann asked Stolpnagel, did you have some conversation with Machinsky about Captain Mensing? And Stolpnagel answers, no, I really know nothing about him. I have seen him, perhaps once or twice, but I heard that he is the head of the Nazis here, Captain Mensing. Somebody once told me, I do not know anymore, but Mr. Wiedemann, if you would like to find out something, you can get anything you want through those two fellows, Machinsky or Bush. Everything you want, more than you can think of, more than you need even. So how about that? In the hunt for information about Nazi activities in the Hamburg American Line North German Lloyd, you could find out everything you want, and more than you can think of or need even, from Machinsky or Bush. And of course he means Prescott Bush. They're talking about the Hamburg American Line. And how many guys named Bush do you think had access to all the top-level stuff associated with Hamburg America? And apparently with access to all the top-level Nazi stuff that was going on within Hamburg America as well. And this is why I believe we see the order of the names on Vesting Order 126 as Bush, Walker, Harriman managed. As I believe Bush was the one who did most of the groundwork and had most of the hands-on day-to-day dealings, which would also explain why we see Major Benno von Stolpnagel testifying that you can get anything you want to know about Nazi activities in Hamburg America from Bush or Machinsky. Now let's fast forward to another set of congressional hearings in 1940 called the Investigation of Un-American Propaganda Activities in the United States. And by this time we see, the North German and Hamburg American Line's offices in New York are hotbeds of Nazi propaganda in America. The North German Lloyd director, H. Mensing, is the official representative of the Nazi Labor Front in America, and that would be the same Captain Mensing we just had a look at. And here we see that in June of 1933, Germany's big business leaders in the United States were summoned to a meeting at the consulate, where they were told it was their duty to finance Nazi propaganda in America. Adolf Scherer, director of the American offices of the Hamburg American Line, and others, including the IG Chemical Corporation, or IG Farben, who we'll be looking at in another chapter of Part 2 of this series. But they were given leading roles in organizing big business as a factor in Nazi propaganda. And looking back to 1933, we see Adolf Scherer is one of the chief supporters in this country of Adolf Hitler. And something I found a little interesting here is that they're asking about a German named Hans Meyer, who was recalled to Germany by the German Consul General in New York. And he was leaving on a Hamburg American ship and had a whole bunch of members of the OD there to see him off. And the OD is the German Ordnungsdienst, which was part of the German Bund in the United States, which was a pro-Nazi organization in the US, and though not officially affiliated with the German Nazi Party, it was indeed the unofficial branch of the Nazi Party in the United States. And the OD, as mentioned, was a wing of the German Bund that acted like a version of the Nazi Party's brown shirts, or later SS, the Goon Squad in other words. And like the brown shirts or the SS, they wore armbands like this. And in February 1939, there was a huge Nazi rally right in Madison Square Gardens, with the German Bund and their Ordnungsdienst guard dogs in action.
I pledge undivided allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
If you ask what we are actively fighting for under our charter, first, a social just white Gentile ruled United States. Second, Gentile-controlled labor union free from Jewish Moscow-directed domination.
So how about that? A huge Nazi rally right in New York City, with 20,000 cheering and Nazi saluting lunatics, complete with a raving madman dictator ranting away at the podium, and some beatings by his rabid fanatical lapdogs. The only thing missing is the book burning. Anyways, back to the Hamburg America lines. Let's have a look at the Nuremberg trials. And in the Flick case, which is the volume with the trial of German industrialist Friedrich Flick, we see in one of the counts against him, the defendants Flick and Steinbrink were members of a group variously known as Friends of Himmler, Freundsquels, or Circle of Friends. This organization was composed of about 30 German business leaders and a number of SS leaders, including Heinrich Himmler, head of the entire SS from 1929 to 1945, and Karl Wolff, Himmler's adjutant, Obergruppenführer, and holder of other high positions in the SS. The business and industrial members of the circle included, and we see I.G. Farben. And flipping over to the next page, we see Hamburg American Shipping Lines. And notice right beside that is Deutsche Bank as well. The circle was formed early in 1932 at Hitler's suggestion by his economic advisor, Wilhelm Kepler. It participated in effecting Hitler's rise to power. So how about that? Hamburg America and other businesses such as I.G. Farben and Deutsche Bank were part of a group called Friends of Himmler, and played a large role in Hitler's rise to power. And here we see the testimony of Karl Lindemann, who was on the board of directors for Hamburg America. And in his testimony we see Matters of the North German Lloyd and the Hamburg-American line with regard to the Reich government were in exactly the same position. And of course, for those who don't know, the Reich government is Hitler's government, the Third Reich as he called it. It's the Nazi party under Hitler ruling Germany. So, as we've seen, Hamburg America was a very important part of the rise of Nazi Germany, and Averell Harriman, George Herbert Walker, and Prescott Bush were a very important part of Hamburg America. And while Hamburg America may have been the first of the Bush-Walker-Harriman managed U.S. Nazi businesses, let's have a look at another, the Union Banking Corporation. And on July 31st, 1941, the New York Tribune was the first to break the news. Thyssen has $3 million cash in New York vaults. And for those who don't know, Fritz Thyssen was one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest, German industrialist who fully supported and helped to finance the Nazi Party's rise. And in the subheadline we see, Union Banking Corporation may hide nest egg for high Nazis he once backed. And here we see, among other Thyssen interests in New York are half a dozen corporations engaged in the shipping, export, and import trades, centering chiefly about the coal and steel industries and operating under the wing of the Union Banking Corporation. And Prescott Bush was the director of at least 3 of those half dozen corporations, which you can find very few details of on the internet these days. I'm yet to find copies of the original vesting orders, but I'll keep searching. Other newspapers at the time would also report about it in their evening editions or the following day, and you can find a few mentions of it in modern media outlets, but of course not very many of the mainstream media wanted to touch the subject in depth. Here we see Prescott Bush's Skull and Bones classmate and fellow Brown Brothers Harriman partner, Knight Woolley, stating, "I should like to give you the background of our connection with the Union Banking Corporation. Our partner W.A. Harriman was in Europe in 1925, and that's a typo. It was actually in 1924, as we can see in the headline, and we'll see coming up as well. Anyways, Knight Woolley goes on about W.A. Harriman in Europe and says, and at that time he became acquainted with Mr. Fritz Thyssen, the German industrialist. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Thyssen formed the Bank for Handel und Schiebfahrt, and presumably controlled that institution. At one of his meetings with Mr. Harriman, he told him he was forming a bank in New York to look after his interests in the United States, and he asked Mr. Harriman to serve on the board. Mr. Harriman agreed that certain of his associates would serve in this capacity, and as a result, various members of the Harriman organization, and now of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, have been on the board ever since." Here we see, the personnel and financial setup of the Union Banking Corporation is provided in the following report of the institution, issued on January 1st, 1941, which reads, Union Banking Corporation, New York, 39 Broadway, organized 1924. And amongst the directors we see Skull and Bones classmates E. Roland Harriman and P. S. Bush, Prescott Sheldon Bush. So that was July 31st, 1941. And of course 4 months later, on December 7th, 1941, Japan would declare war on the United States by launching a sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. Four days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy would declare war on the United States, and the United States would declare war on Germany and Italy. By 1942, almost all of Europe was under the control of, or allied with, Nazi Germany. And remember, it was in July of 1941 that the news came out that the Union Banking Corporation was started by Fritz Thyssen, who helped finance Hitler's rise to power, and that several partners from Brown Brothers Harriman were on the board of directors of the Union Banking Corporation, and they had $3 million in Nazi money stashed away. So even though the government knew about links between Harriman partners and the Nazis in 1934, and the public would know about the Union Banking Corporation's link to the Nazis in July of 1941, the government still didn't seize the, quote, first Bush-Walker-Harriman managed U.S. business, Hamburg-American line, end quote, until August of 1942, 8 months after the U.S. declared war on Germany. and they didn't seize the Union Banking Corporation and its subsidiaries until October. And personally, I believe that delay was done on purpose, to allow Harriman, Bush, and the rest to sever as many ties as possible and clean up the books, in order to reduce the amount of scandal and damage. When the news emerged about the Union Banking Corporation in July of 1941, it technically wasn't illegal at that time, as the U.S. wasn't at war with Germany yet, but it certainly wasn't good optics in the public eye by that point either. And we can see that in the weeks following the release of the story in the newspapers, the FBI launched an investigation into how E. Roland Harriman had the stock of the Union Banking Corporation in his name. And we see here that 3,991 shares are in E. Roland Harriman's name. And below we see one share in Prescott Bush's name. Ultimately, the FBI would conclude, all of the above stockholders merely held the stock as nominees for the Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart. They are merely nominees in directing that the dividend be paid to the Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart. So in other words, the FBI is saying that although E. Roland Harriman, Prescott Bush, and the other directors had the Union Banking Corporation shares in their names, it was actually owned by the Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart. And Harriman, Bush, and the other directors sent any incoming money to the Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart. And of course the Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart was owned by the Thyssen family, led by Fritz Thyssen. And I'm going to speculate that this setup with Harriman, Bush, and the others having the Union Banking Corporation shares in their names was done because Thyssen wouldn't have been allowed to own the bank legally in his name. I'm not 100% sure on that, but ultimately the FBI investigation resulted in nothing. And as mentioned, it wouldn't be until more than a year later, in October of 1942, that the government would then seize the Union Banking Corporation and all of its assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And let's have a look at some of that investigation. The Union Banking Corporation is an investment company, and prior to the outbreak of the war was engaged in buying and selling securities principally for the account of Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart, NV, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. At present, the corporation is buying and selling United States securities and prime commercial paper through Brown Brothers Harriman and Company for its own account. Subject Corporation was incorporated August 4, 1924 under Article 7 of the Banking Laws of the State of New York, with an authorized capital of $400,000, represented by 4,000 shares of common stock, par value 100, all of which have been issued and are outstanding. The subject corporation banks with Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, 59 Wall Street, New York City, and maintains inactive accounts with the Guarantee Trust Company, 140 Broadway, Chase National Bank, 11 Broad Street, and National City Bank, 52 Wall Street, all of New York City. And there's some familiar names. Union Banking Corporation was originally organized by several of the partners of Harriman and Company, now Brown Brothers Harriman and Company. W.O.L Harriman was in Europe sometime prior to 1924, and at that time became acquainted with Fritz Thyssen, the German industrialist. Thyssen had formed the Bank Voorhandel and Scheepvaart in Rotterdam, and presumably controlled that institution. At one of his meetings with Harriman, Thyssen told Harriman that he was forming a bank in New York to look after his interests in the United States, and asked Harriman to serve on the board. Harriman agreed that certain of his associates would serve as directors, and as a result, various members of the Harriman organization have been on the board of the Union Banking Corporation ever since. So, not only did the government wait until August and October of 1942, respectively, to seize the various Bush-Walker-Harriman managed businesses with Nazi ties, but I also wonder about how many portions of this report were actually written by members of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company. If that paragraph under the title History of the Corporation sounded familiar, it's because the bulk of the content of it was literally taken word for word from the statement of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company partner, Knight Woolley, in July of 1941. The incorporators, as reflected by the Certificate of Incorporation dated at New York City on August 4, 1924, were, and of the four Harriman and Company partners, we see E. Roland Harriman and Samuel F. Pryor, who we saw a few times in Part 1 of this series. All of the capital stock of Union Banking Corporation since the inception of the corporation has been registered in the names of the directors and held by them as nominees for the Bank Voorhandel en Scheepvaart, Rotterdam, the Netherlands. A majority of the shares, 3,991 out of 4,000, are registered in the name of E. Roland Harriman, chairman of the board, and the remaining shares are in the names of the other directors. The stock is kept in safe deposit box number 9713 in the name of Bank Voorhandel en Scheepvaart at the Chase Safe Deposit Company, 25 Broadway, New York City. Bank Voorhandel en Scheepvaart, NV, which owns the stock of the Union Banking Corporation, is of German origin, having been established in 1918 by the Thyssen family of Germany. Until the middle of 1939, there would be no change in the ownership of Bank Voorhandel en Scheepvaart. And that's because Thyssen and Hitler had a falling out, and the Nazis took over all of his businesses. Which means that from the middle of 1939 until the seizures in 1942, anything the Union Banking Corporation's assets, or businesses, that Bush, Harriman, and the other Brown Brothers Harriman and Company partners managed, were doing so directly with the Nazis, as opposed to Thyssen, the once major financer to the Nazi Party. And as of October 1942, the present directors of Union Banking Corporation are, and 4 of them are from Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, including E. Roland Harriman and Prescott S. Bush. From the same investigation a few days later on October 9, 1942, we see it is recommended that the alien property custodian vest all of the 4,000 shares of common stock of $100 par value of Union Banking Corporation, room 2501, 39 Broadway, New York, New York. And then we see they echo the FBI's investigation from August of 1941, writing, "Said stock is held by the above-named individuals, however, solely as nominees for the Bank Voorhandel en Scheepvaart, NV, Rotterdam, Holland, which is owned by one or more of the Thyssen family, nationals of Germany and Hungary. The 4,000 shares hereinafter set out are therefore beneficially owned and held for the interest of enemy nationals, and are vestable by the alien property custodian. In the event this recommendation receives favorable consideration, it is suggested that this case be referred to the Liquidation Division." And in the Federal Register from November 7, 1942, we see Vesting Order Number 248, seizing all the capital stock of the Union Banking Corporation, executed on October 20, 1942. From the Guardian article about Prescott Bush and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party, I found this to be a very interesting quote from a letter sent in 1933 from Knight Woolley to Averell Harriman, talking about the Consolidated Celestian Steel Company, which would be one of the companies seized in 1942. In the Guardian article we see, Bush's friend and fellow bonesman Knight Woolley, another partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, wrote to Averell Harriman in January 1933 warning of problems with CSSC after the Poles, Poland, started the drive to nationalize the plant. The Consolidated Celestian Steel Company situation has become increasingly complicated, and I have accordingly brought in Sullivan and Cromwell in order to be sure that our interests are protected, wrote Knight. After studying the situation, Foster Dulles is insisting that their man in Berlin get into the picture and obtain the information which the directors here should have. You will recall that Foster is a director, and he is particularly anxious to be certain there is no liability attaching to the American directors. So how about that? Foster Dulles is a director with those guys. And for those who don't know who he is, he's the older brother of the more famous, or infamous, Allen Dulles, the once longtime CIA director until President John F. Kennedy asked him to resign. Anyways, we'll have a look at the Dulles brothers in an upcoming chapter, but as we've seen, Prescott Bush, George Herbert Walker, the Harrimans, and more were very instrumental in the rise of Nazi Germany. And something I've noticed while going through the records, there's no talk about the fact that from the years 1920, when Averell Harriman started up the Hamburg American line again, and 1924 when they incorporated the Union Banking Corporation, right up until the news broke in July of 1941 about the Union Banking Corporation having Nazi money, I could find nothing about how much money and materials they sent to Germany over the years, including all through the rise of Hitler's Nazi Party. That information's not to be found, or was just never investigated perhaps. Anyways, I could go on with all kinds of unanswered questions here. But again, as we've seen, Prescott Bush and his friends did indeed have a helping hand in the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. And they were just one group of many, as we'll see in yet another upcoming chapter. But here's something interesting. At the same time that Prescott Bush was the director for the Union Banking Corporation and a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, and remember this little tidbit we saw in the investigation about what the Union Banking Corporation was doing as of October 5th, 1942. At present, the corporation is buying and selling United States securities and prime commercial papers through Brown Brothers Harriman and Company for its own account. Well, we see in the news about the USO that earlier, in June of 1942, John D. Rockefeller Jr. is honorary chairman in the nationwide campaign, and Prescott S. Bush of New York City is the national campaign chairman. So how do you like that? Prescott Bush is the national campaign chairman of the United Service Organizations, while at the same time as being the director of the Union Banking Corporation, having a share in his name that was beneficially owned and held for the interest of enemy nationals. And notice we also see another example of the second generation of the Wall Street kings intertwined and working together, much like the first generation did. A year later, in April of 1943, we see Prescott Bush becomes the national campaign chairman of the National War Fund. So obviously any of his dealings with Nazi-related businesses wasn't about to hurt his status and prospects going forward. And in 1950 he would run for senator of Connecticut, although he wouldn't win. And we also see then Congressman Richard Nixon running for senator in California. And by 1952, Prescott Bush would get a seat in the Senate representing Connecticut after the death of Senator Brian McMahon. And they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I think these speak volumes. Look at the glow on Nixon's face. Little Richie Nixon looks like Richie Cunningham after getting a kiss on the cheek from Lori Beth. And of course the Bush-Nixon relationship would also become generational. And here's Prescott Bush with his good buddy and golfing partner, President Dwight Eisenhower, sitting behind the desk with him at the Oval Office, apparently overseeing what the president is signing. And it makes sense they're good friends at this time, as President Eisenhower, before he was president, was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. And here's Prescott Bush with yet another US president, but one he was most definitely not fond of, as we'll see. And the first time I tried to upload this video, Part 2, Chapter 1, it was blocked by a copyright claim on the sound of the video of JFK that's playing in the bottom left corner. So I've had to go back in and redo this section and remove the sound of that video. But imagine that, someone owns the rights of JFK's speech and we're not allowed to hear it, or at least I'm not allowed to post it for you to hear. It's actually Sony that owns it, but we'll blame it on Walter Cronkite anyways. And keep in mind my channel and the videos on it as of this publishing date have never been monetized, nor do I have plans of doing such in the near future or anything. All you hear on the video is the television announcer introducing the event, and then JFK goes to the podium and tells a couple of jokes that the Yale audience all laugh at, and that's it. So I do find it rather interesting that this particular clip would be blocked. He only tells a couple of jokes that take some sly potshots at Yale. JFK graduated from Harvard, and here Yale is just simply awarding him an honorary degree. And here's the jokes he told. Quote, "It might be said now that I have the best of both worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree," end quote. And the audience laughs. Then he says, quote, "I am particularly glad to become a Yale man, for as I think about my troubles, a lot of them have come from other Yale men," end quote. And then the audience laughs again. And it's interesting to see him poking a few jokes at Yale, even saying that a lot of his troubles have come from Yale men. And remember, Yale is where you'll find the secretive Skull and Bone Society, which Prescott Bush was part of. And while we're on the topic of Prescott Bush and JFK, here's a letter Prescott Bush sent in 1969 to Clover Dulles, Allen Dulles' now widow after his death, and in it we see him write some pretty interesting things. I recall in the summer of 1961 after the ill-fated Bay of Pigs affair, and he goes on to tell Clover Dulles about when she was away one time and Allen Dulles came over for dinner with John McCone. And below Prescott writes, he, meaning Allen Dulles, tried to make a pleasant evening of it, but I was rather sick at heart, and angry too, for it was the Kennedys that brought about that fiasco, and here they were making Allen to be the goat, which he wasn't and did not deserve. I have never forgiven them. So like I say, that's some pretty interesting reading. In the summer of 1961, in the ill-fated Bay of Pigs fiasco he's talking about, is when the CIA and some anti-Castro Cubans tried to invade Cuba and failed, and what led to Allen Dulles being told to resign from his longtime position as director of the CIA. And notice he says he was angry because it was the Kennedys' fault. Kennedys plural. And of course he means both President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time of the Bay of Pigs failure. And his last statement there, I've never forgiven them. And what's interesting there is that he's talking about the dinner he had with Allen Dulles in 1961, after he had to quit as CIA director, and Prescott Bush is angry, blames the Kennedys, and has never forgiven them. Which means that when they were together at the Yale ceremony in 1962, those were all crocodile smiles coming from Prescott Bush. And then JFK went onto the stage to make some cracks about Yale, and some, quote, Yale men. Anyways, after his career as a senator was over in January of 1963, Prescott Bush would go back to private life and back to his once Nazi-supporting criminal organization, Brown Brothers Harriman and Company. And on October 8, 1972, Prescott Bush would die at the age of 77 years old. And from his obituary the next day, we see his old little buddy, now President, Richard Nixon, issued a statement saying,
"Well, I'm not a crook."
Wait, he didn't say that. Yet. But he did give Prescott Bush a ringing endorsement saying, "The nation has lost a citizen of exceptional honor and integrity." Now let's have a listen to Prescott Bush from his days as a senator.
It's time for the Longines Chronoscope, a television journal of the important issues of the hour, brought to you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. A presentation of the Longines Wittnauer Watch Company, maker of Longines, the world's most honored watch, and Wittnauer, distinguished companion to the world-honored Longines. Good evening, this is Frank Knight. May I introduce our co-editors for this edition of the Longines Chronoscope? Edward P. Morgan and Winston Burdett, both of the CBS television news staff. Our distinguished guest for this evening is the Honorable Prescott Bush, United States Senator from Connecticut.
Senator Bush, just the other night, a Republican colleague of yours in the House of Representatives, Congressman Hugh Scott of Philadelphia, sitting in the same seat that you're occupying now on Chronoscope, had some rather rough things to say about what he called the extreme right wing of the Republican Party. He said, in effect, that this wing was hobbling the Eisenhower administration's program and regime, and that it should stop it. What is your comment on that, sir?
Well, I noticed that Mr. Scott made remarks to that effect. My feeling was that they were a little severe and not entirely justified. I think that so often votes down there take place on what I'd call an area basis rather than a party basis, and sometimes it gives the impression that within the party there are dissidents who are making things difficult. Of course, I don't want to deny the fact that there have been some Republicans in both houses that have been a little bit reluctant to go along with some of the administration's plans and some of the Congress's ideas. Nevertheless, I feel that in any great important issues that the Republicans would pretty much stand together. I don't entirely agree with Mr. Scott.
By important issues, do you mean domestic issues, Senator, or issues of national security?
Well, I would say issues of paramount national interest, national importance that might really affect the national security and be generally recognized as issues that that affect the national security.
That was 1953, and I wonder how many more decades we'll be hearing from someone with the last name of Bush telling us about national security.
It appears that the Oliver North trial will go forward next week now. Are you aware of secrets so damaging to our national security that might come out in that trial? That would be so damaging that you would ask the Attorney General to halt the prosecution?
I think the Attorney General knows everything I know, and I think he's handled it very well. And has worked out an agreement that hopefully is workable, but we'll see, because there are legitimate national security interests.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team.
And the simple fact is that these are Islamic terrorists that have co-opted a faith that is peaceful, but nevertheless, this is something we need to fight. And I don't think anybody would question that my brother was in that fight, that he viewed it as a national security fight, and he led. And that's what we need to do again.